In this episode, I'm joined once again by Steve Knepper to discuss Byung-Chul Han's book, The Spirit of Hope, alongside discussions on Cormac McCarthy's The Road, Wonder, and Fear. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.
All right, Steve Knepper, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks, James. Always a pleasure to be here.
So after our previous chat, or previous two chats, but the previous one between just me and yourself on Byung-Chul Han's Palliative Society, we've returned for another Byung-Chul Han, which is his latest, which is The Spirit of Hope. This was released by Polity Press, I think just the end of last year. So The Spirit of Hope with illustrations by Anselm Kiefer, which seems somewhat paradoxical for hope, but this is a book about hope, about fear, about our modern relationship to hope. In its very typical Han, it draws on thinkers such as Heidegger, it draws on Gabriel Marcel, one of your favorites, and it doesn't really pull any punches. It's accessible in certain ways. And it's tackling the topic of what to do with hope and what hope actually is. So, but you really emphasized after we finished recording our last chat, you said that this is one that you were sort of digging into and finding very intriguing. So why you really did push this for me to go read? So what was it about this one that struck a chord?
Well, one thing that definitely strikes a chord for me is that he draws so much on Gabriel Marcel, that early 20th century French existentialist. And I've always thought that Han and Marcel make a good pairing. I've been surprised that Han doesn't draw on him more, because what they both share is this emphasis on opening up the self, on receptivity, on not being so focused on projects, on your own hopes, fears, delusions, that you can't truly be available to other people or to the world. It's interesting that in this book, he's reflecting on Marcel's famous essay about hope that Marcel published during the Nazi occupation of France. And he uses a epigraph from Marcel for this book. But there's a passage in Marcel's essay that I think is key to why Han was drawn to it, that doesn't actually show up in The Spirit of Hope. And that passage is one where Marcel talks about how true hope opens up the ego. True hope dilates you so that you are open to both the struggles of the world, but also to the contingency of the future. I think that that's something that Han's been searching for from the beginning of his philosophy. You can see it in Heidegger's Heart, his first book that grows out of a dissertation. But often he's been looking for that in other fundamental moods like profound boredom, which is not the restless boredom that we might struggle with when we're at the bus station and we reach out and pull out our phone to fill the moment. But this profound boredom where we sink through all those cares and then suddenly open up again to the world. Han's not repudiating that. I think he still thinks that's a very important thing. But one of the great criticisms of Han has always been, how do you get from that to something like action? He says repeatedly throughout his works that contemplation and action go together, that contemplation prepares the way for decisive action. But it's pretty easy to critique profound boredom as a starting place for action. I don't think it's fair necessarily, but I think that I think that's one of the critiques of him, and that he seems quietist. He doesn't seem to engage with politics. Hope has a contemplative dimension. It has that openness, that patience, but it also is ready to act, he says. So I think that this is Han's way to try to offer more of a political vision. And I think it's also his way to sort of specify that relationship between contemplation and action.
It's interesting, though, that there's a lot of opposites of dynamism between hope, profound boredom, contemplation, action, openness. I mean, all of these have got their own directions there. But you mentioned the epigraph, which is from Marcel's Being and Having, and it says, hope is a spring, it is the leaping of a gulf. So we are dealing with, I an openness, a sort of flooding. But so with regards, I mean, just to begin, as you've sort of pointed out, this element of profound boredom against, or different to just standing and being bored, profound boredom, that seems like the end of something, like something's about to break, but it's not a breaking that we can have any, let's say, explicit agency. You can't choose to say, right, I'm just going to not be bored. I'm not going to be profoundly bored now. So something has to be enough, and from that there has to come, or, well, it doesn't have to, I guess, but there seems to Han, I mean, maybe this is the progression of his thinking, is that it's almost that point of bottom of the barrel. Bottom of the barrel of boredom. What's next? Well, it can only be an openness of, I will just open myself toward a hope. But that, I think the problem there would be, is that could lean into sort of something that's, so profoundly bored in this Harnian sense with regard to the modern world, with regard to being burnt out, with regard to being in this sort of dead, dying, grey egregore that we spoke a bit more about in the Paleo Society, where nothing's really giving us anything, that could come across as, well, you're so profoundly bored that you just open up to anything, and it's sort of like almost like a delusion. Like, you know what? Let's just see. That seems a bit dangerous, even. And we could probably see that type of hope actually enacting itself politically now as well. So what do you, to begin with more so this book, the Han differentiates and he says absolute hope. So is this the hope you see as coming from the break of this profound boredom, the spring coming forth that Marcel talks about in that epigraph?
Yeah, such a good question. In a way, I don't want to just turn the page on profound boredom in Han, and I don't think he does either. I don't think he's rejecting that. There are many, many ways to approach this, but one way that has its limits would be to think about Han as a really sharp diagnostician, and then thinking about, okay, if this is the problem, how do we get out of it? So one problem for sure that he starts laying out in his famous breakthrough work, The Burnout Society, he talks about how we are hooked on achievement. We're just relentlessly clicking. We're binge watching. We're trying to get likes. We're trying to get the promotion. We just are achieving and working ourselves to the point of exhaustion. Mm-hmm. Well, if that's a problem, then it makes sense to think about profound boredom as a solution, because that exhaustion is right on the cusp. If you can just embrace it and open up and dilate the self, then you go from the state of exhaustion, the state of that kind of restless boredom, and you open up into a whole new experience of the world. Mm-hmm. So that might be one way to think about what he's doing with profound boredom. And I think that's pretty important. In your conversation with Norman Wurzba on Hope a couple weeks ago, which was just a phenomenal conversation, and we'll probably refer to it a lot throughout this one. But you said something along those lines. You said, I think people are getting bored with scrolling on their phones. Mm. You said, I think that there's actually some hope or some reason to think we might be coming out of this screen addict age because people are just getting exhausted with it. That's maybe close to how I read one of the things Han's doing with profound boredom. But let's say that he has been disappointed about people's ability to move from restlessness to exhaustion to profound boredom. Maybe he thinks, oh yeah, actually the distractions are so good that we're not gonna get there. Or maybe he thinks, okay, there's also this danger of restless emphatic action. Something has to be done now, even if it's just performative. Mm. Hope's interesting in that hope involves a certain patience. So you have to be okay with the fact that you don't know how things are going to turn out right away. But also it involves this readiness to act in the world, to try to make a little difference, to try to help people in the here and now, to be looking for possibilities to open up that different pathway into the future. So maybe if we approach it from the problem he's trying to diagnose, maybe in the spirit of hope, one of the things he's looking at is we really struggle with this sense of patient, ready openness facing the future.
So one thing, I've jotted quite a lot down from that. So you began with, really from the Burnout Society and the more Harnian cornerstones of achievement, of likes, of the aggrandizement of quantity, of you mentioned that the dilation of the self, I guess the broadening of the self. It seems to me that the self, or the modern self, is built from that achievement-based thing. Next career leap, next promotion, next peer-reviewed article, next book, or throw in all the academic ones. The next little line on the CV that bolsters the ego and the self that is. And the sort of paradoxical question, which, Han, as a Christian, I think can be brought. We can really draw Kierkegaard's leap in here, which isn't simply a leap of faith. It's a leap of uninductive. It's an uninductive leap between categories, right? So it's like there is no inductive means to leap between categories. And so what's interesting is we talk about this like acceleration and bolstering of achievement, of quantity, of likes, which is growing and growing and growing into this profound boredom that I do believe is, people are getting profoundly bored. They're noticing their symptom, like to look at your phone while simultaneously saying, I am, what are you going to do later? I'm going to doom scroll. For me, that's a positive, because at least, it's like someone who's noticed, oh, I'm depressed or something, right? That's a step in the right direction, as bleak as it might seem. But the reason I bring the Kierkegaard in is, well, that's all quantity. And how is it that can categorically leap through to the dilation of the self, which is not just an inverse, it's categorically different because it's quality, right? It's love, it's openness, it's the dissolving of the self. And you can't do that it's like trying to find a quantified means to not scroll on your phone. Everyone will tell you it doesn't work. Minimalism app, because it's still quantity. Like I've got 3 minimalism apps, right? Or something like, doesn't work. So I wonder that's like the impossible question anyway. But what it is that suddenly transforms for the terminus of quantity to just break, and all of a sudden you're engaged with, passion or love or openness, which don't have that metric like thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does make sense.
That's good.
And this is something that Han could have said more about, I think, in the book. He's getting at that. He talks about how hope isn't even a virtue in the Aristotelian sense of something you can just practice and build up like a skill. I suspect, given how he draws on theology throughout here, he would agree that hope is a theological or infused virtue. And even if you're not religious yourself, there's some wisdom to that. There's this idea that hope is not something you can just force, even if you can cooperate with it. Hope you might be able to create certain circumstances that allow it to flourish. But you can't force it. There's this gift nature to it. It's something you're gifted with. It's something that arises. Now, I do think that doesn't mean you're just either have it or you don't. I do think there's this aspect of opening yourself to at least the means by which the gift of hope might arrive. And here we see it in the Spirit of Hope, but maybe also in other Han books like The Agony of Eros. We'll set aside the question of God for the moment, though I think we'll come back to that, of course. And this is a very theological book compared to Han's other books. But even we think about the human other. So if we are trying to stay out of our head and be open to others, seeing their need, seeing their smile, allowing ourselves to be open to them can allow the other to give us the gift of hope. So let's talk about, I think it helps to make these things concrete. And one way I think that Han could have made this book better was through more examples, by offering kind of a descriptive phenomenology of hope in different situations. But let's take a cliche that you see in so many movies and books. Let's take the parent, often it's the dad, who is thoroughly hopeless in many ways. They're thoroughly pessimistic in many ways. They see that the world's fallen apart. They see that they're in this awful situation. But it's the child that's there with them that inspires them to keep going and to have hope. Think about McCarthy's The Road, which, like many McCarthy novels, takes kind of this literary cliche or filmic cliche and elevates it to art. I mean, that's the plot of the book. The dad, I don't think, has much hope in a concrete solution. But there's a way in which he's not just caring for the child, but the child's giving him the gift of hope, which he then makes the return gift of caring for the son. And in this flipping, the notion that the son's giving the father the gift of hope kind of becomes stronger as the book goes on. And there's a way in which the son almost exhorts him to hope at various places. So I think that that's an interesting point, that hope is something we can cooperate with. We can create the circumstances for it. But one of the best ways we can create that circumstance goes back to that fundamental move of Hans, which is dilating the self, being open to others, the world, God, and allowing them to give you the gift of the call to hope.
We sort of materialize hope, though, in that sense, because when I think about The Road, and also one that Hahn mentions in relation to Mark Fisher, the Children of Men,
Sure.
There's a certain sense of complete disbelief, right, in the endings of both of those films. And I haven't read the book Children of Men. I believe the film is superior. But, a lot of people who are fans of McCarthy will say that The Road is his weakest. I would agree. Because I think I have not just in relation to, the astounding brutality of Blood Meridian or whatever it might be, but just a niggling sense of, does McCarthy really believe what he's writing? It's almost like, but in a certain sense, because, the sort of biography of that book is that he wrote it for his son while in Ireland, I believe. So it's sort of for his son type thing of being a new father and having to find hope, I guess, in the modern world in that sense. There is both that sort of a push-pull or sort of pain of, you can sense, this is my own reading, you can sense that McCarthy almost doesn't believe what he's writing, because all these moments of stereotypical hope in the book, the finding of all the food in the bunker, and then the family at the end that have a child and a dog, they're almost like unbelievable in this sense.
Sure.
But then at the same time, you think, well, maybe that is what hope has to be, is that there's just an element of having to let down the walls of cynicism, and just allow, well, okay, maybe it's a bit cheesy. Like hope can't not be cheesy. But we're all a bit too ultimately hopeless and jaded to be able to let it in. I mean, I think of the ending of Children of Men. I remember my first reaction to the end of Children of Men is like, that's all well and good, but if she's the only one who's having a baby, then what good is that? But I really sort of realized, like, I've materialized the symbol. And so that's not what hope is, right? But maybe I'm still very jaded about that. But
well, this is a great thing to get into. And maybe for listeners that haven't read The Road, it'd be helpful to just say quickly the plot in a nutshell. Dad and son, post-apocalyptic world, probably nuclear post-apocalyptic, but McCarthy leaves that unexplained to some extent. Almost no food left. Most humans are cannibals. Very few humans even survived. So this father-son wandering across the United States, heading towards the coast. And they keep talking about carrying the fire. And that's kind of their metaphor for carrying on. Very end of the book, spoiler alert, dad dies, and miraculously they run into this other family that's going to take in the child, and they're going to continue carrying the fire. Like many others, I actually agreed at first when I read it that McCarthy had flinched, that he doesn't really believe this, that this is a saccharine ending. But actually preparing for this conversation, I kept thinking about The Road. And I thought, well, maybe the point isn't that they're going to actually make it through okay, because the prospects for this family are still incredibly grim. Maybe it's more that it's getting at this idea of a fundamental hope, a radical hope, that as long as humans are open to it, or are gifted with it, I should say, and can cultivate it, can see it in each other, then it can carry on even to the very end of humanity, even as humanity snuffs out.
Yeah.
And in that way, maybe the point of the road isn't that eventually the world's going to be fine for this boy. Maybe they're going to still die, but maybe the remarkable thing is that they can carry on in this spirit of hope despite all of the horrific circumstances.
I mean, that's a good example. It's a great example because, as you said, there's still hope there, but it's absolutely not optimistic, and it's explicitly not optimistic. It cannot be optimistic, which brings in, a point that Hahn makes, which is that optimism and pessimism for him are one and the same. But then he brings in my own opinion, he brings in his own duality that he sort of overlooks, if I'm being a little bit critical. But fear is this other huge factor in this book. If it's if hope is the protagonist of this book, then fear is the antagonist. But it's whether or not they are, and it's a bit risky to say with Hahn as a Catholic, but it just comes across as a touch Manichaean, as if one could, as if they're equals, right? That's the problem. As if one could bounce out one could win in this Manichaean sense, but
Sure.
Hope can't be that. There's always some other element that takes it above or beyond, or yeah, I guess it just is that openness. But yeah, what do you think of Hahn's sort of, I guess, first the collapsing of optimism and pessimism into a single thing?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'd want to collapse them exactly the way that he does, but I do buy his basic point that optimism is sure things are going to turn out okay, and pessimism are sure that things are going to turn out poorly. And both of them involve a strange sort of resignation and a strange lack of openness to contingency. And that's one of the things that he insists again and again about hope, is that hope embraces the contingency of the future. Hope doesn't necessarily think that things are going to turn out better, but hope thinks you should carry on because you don't know how things are going to turn out. So there's a passage early on that I might just read that has been a real touchstone for me. And of course, I'm reading this book through the lens of where Hahn's been before, on his emphasis of openness and receptivity. I'm also reading it coming from someone from Marcel, someone that studies Marcel, loves Marcel. Probably other ways to read this book, but I think that this is fair to emphasize these things. But early on in The Spirit of Hope, Hahn writes, "But only hope can give us back that life which is more than mere survival. It is hope that opens a meaningful horizon that reinvigorates and inspires life. Hope presents us with a future." So I think that you can carry on as a pessimist, but it often is as just a mere survival. And you can look forward to the future as an optimist, but it's not really a true openness to the future. And the future isn't spread out as a horizon. It's either a very particular idea that this one thing's going to save us, or this one person, or it's a very, very diffuse idea that, I don't really need to worry about it because everything will be okay. But what characterizes hope for Hahn is this opening up of the horizon of the future. And I would say that as we go throughout the book, there's a way in which hope opens up not just the future, but also the present. So if you're a hopeful person, you're able to, despite all the challenges that are looming over the future, you're able to attend to what you need to attend to in the moment. And those might be very prosaic things. It might be changing your baby's diaper or saying a kind word to your kids when they're annoying you. It might be taking care of a small problem that's very important to a person, but seems very small set alongside nuclear war or climate collapse or something like that. And I think Hahn would say that that's the difference between survival and life, being able to be present in the moment like that. But then I think he would say, too, that hope opens up the past in that it allows for the past to be reinterpreted. It allows for the past not to be a railroad track of that's sort of just carrying us forward in one direction. It allows for surprises to emerge from the past too. So there's a sense that hope kind of opens up a horizon for past, present, and future, I would say, for Han. I might bring in another literary example for just a moment. A book that, a short story, I should say, that I really like by Willa Cather. It's called My Neighbor Rosicky. So it's about this Czech farmer in the early 20th century out on the American prairie. Very Cather, if you've read other novels of hers. And this guy used to live in London, then he lived in New York City. He had some really, really hard experiences. And at one point at his lowest point while he's living in London, he received this incredible gift from these strangers. And I won't go into it to spoil it. But that seems to reorient his whole approach to life. So living out on the frontier, often it's really, really tough. And at one point in the book, his crops have all failed. There's been this drought and all the corn's withered up. And they have some really hard times ahead of them as a family. But Rosicky, who's not a perfect guy, he has his flaws, but I would say he's kind of a saintly guy. What he's able to do in that afternoon when he realizes his crop has failed is he tells his wife, you know what, let's prepare a big dinner for the kids. Let's make a nice dessert and let's take them swimming. And it's not escapism. It's this ability to be in the moment and to let go of what you can't control and realize that the future still has a certain openness. Because it'd be very, very easy in that possibility. I could see it in myself to suddenly just snap at your kids, right? To suddenly just go into a fit of despair and anger. But there's a real strength and courage that comes through in Rosicky in his ability to still have that present openness and attend to his kids, attend to what's under his control, give that gift of kindness and love. And I think that that's undergirded by a kind of hope. And I see that as part of what Han's getting at.
Yeah, and I mean to stay with, just very briefly, and also to bring in two interests there together. I mean, to stay with Willa Cather, I haven't read loads, but My Antonia is very much the same feeling. And the feeling I would focus on there, actually, is probably the same feeling of The Road as well, is that humans have agency, but they're not the primary agency. And that the Road, even though the writing is very minimal, there's these little seeds, especially the ending scene, which so many people talk about the greatness of the ending scene. But these little seeds of wonder, Willa Cather more so with the nature writing, is that you get this impression that the world is full of wonder that isn't necessarily, fully hostile, but isn't necessarily fully friendly. That her way of writing places humans just within a world that is its own thing, that is wondrous, but wonder can include something that is going to be, subtly antagonistic or frictionful for these human beings. And so it's in that I guess it's sort of that removal of the priority of human agency, where hope becomes what it is outside of the bounds of optimism and pessimism, which are very strictly human things and very defeatist in a way not to live. And I think of, I'm glad you mentioned Willa Cather, actually, because of something such as the story you mentioned, All My Antonia, from page 22 of the book we're talking about. Han says to live means to hope. And it's in books such as that and books such as The Road that we see, okay, well, the world is there. The world is given, and it's given in such a way that it's clear that it's full of misery, full of strife, full of also of moments of joy that arise organically. But what to live is to live amidst that. And something, if anything, is radical about this book, and maybe Han generally, it's that I think a lot of philosophy and a lot of writing, whether or not it explicitly says so, is not necessarily anti-life, but is at the very least cynical and pessimistic and holds living at arm's reach. And it's a very radical thing, I think, to say, go live, because the general sentiment has been one of things aren't good, the worst people are getting voted in, climate's climate's not going well, people are earning less. Like every single factor of existence, the supposed pessimistic vision is true. And so we don't hear much about living, about what it is to live. And to say that to live means to hope, I think is fairly radical.
Yeah, I agree. And at least how I read that line, which I'm glad you brought it up. I think that's an important line. But listeners might be thinking, okay, how can he say that hope is to live, and to say that hope is a gift? It's this thing that you can't force, right? To say that hope is to live makes it sound like you automatically hope if you're living. But here I think that if you read Hahn across his works, but in this book too, again, it's the difference between kind of a bare life and a true living. To sort of have a true human existence, which for Hahn would be being open to others, being open to the world, not being closed in on yourself, not living in the fantasy world of hopes and fears, or hopes not in his sense, you know what I mean, but to actually be in contact with reality in some sort of full, rich way. If you go to the road, the cannibals have bare life, but I don't think that they're living in Hahn's sense. They're not supernatural, but there's something undead about them. Whereas the man and his son, even though they're struggling and they're not flourishing in the grandest sense, I do think they're living in this richer sense for Hahn. And let's take it out of the more extreme apocalyptic scenarios, closer to our own. Well, maybe we're not that far away from that, I don't know, but at least into our own moment and Hahn's other concerns about the digital. I think Hahn would say that if you're always doom scrolling, or if you're always engaging with the world through emoting online, you're participating in his online shitstorms, as he calls them. If you are so caught up in fears about, say, climate collapse, that you can't attend to the people around you, or that you're just crippled before your computer screen, I think Hahn would say you're not living either. And you're actually not doing the small things you're capable of doing to make the situation better.
I mean, it might be to repeat yourself, but what do you think? What do you think it is for Hahn for us to be fearful, to live in fear?
Yeah, and I liked your point earlier that there's a danger in how Hahn frames it, to make fear and hope just simply opposed to one another. And I don't think that it would be. Well, let me put it this way. I think that as I read Hahn, even though he doesn't spell it out this way, I think he would concede that the father and son on the road are fearful a lot of the time, and rightly so, and that doesn't just cancel out their hope. I think the experience of, like, the affect of fear, I don't think is what he's getting at. I think he's more getting at a fearful orientation to life as a whole, fear as a fundamental mood. And if that's your basic disposition towards the world, then everything constricts to your fear. Again, that horizon that hope opens up contracts to a threat, contracts to a sense that there isn't a contingency in the future. There's just a threat that's going to get us eventually.
It's probably because,
and I think that's in that way. I think in that way, hope and fear are opposed to one another.
Yeah,
as a fundamental moods.
Yeah.
But I think that as affect, fear runs throughout hope in any kind of hard situation.
I think that the opposition there becomes different, because it's one of porosity or clogging.
Yeah.
A lot of people are clogged up by doom scrolling or whatever it might be. I mean, they're still living, but there's a sense of, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go do a bungee jump or whatever, but it might even mean that you step out of your door, right? Or eat a new meal or something. But I wonder if there's just a third party here, because at the moment it all seems very like there needs to be some intervention, right? Like, well, how do we get from there to there? Like, what is it to do that? You can't just get up as a human and just suddenly step out of your door and be like, I'm going to hope and I'm not going to be fearful anymore in the sense that we've been talking about. That doesn't just happen in those ways. And I think it's because of all the Marcel, but I wonder if the wedge or the sort of the icebreaker or the pickaxe that, or maybe it's more general than that, it probably is wonder, right? Like whatever wonder is, like some engagement with the mystery of being. And you know, I think Hans works have done this to me about 3 times now, where you end up talking about things that could be on Hallmark cards.
Sure.
And maybe that just is what the bare bones truth of things is. But yeah, and there's in that side of fear, what fear is seems to be comfort, right? And pessimism and optimism are both comfortable. I know the direction, and even if it's bad, it's like you're optimistic. If you're pessimist, you're optimist because you know it, and it's comfortable and controlled. And what openness is vulnerability. And I wonder, yeah, just if wonder, that engagement with something that's kind of trembling or whatever it might be, just is like a positive discomfort. But my worry there, but Hahn is writing as a religious thinker, really, in himself, is that is hope really only to be engaged via an engagement with the sacred, of at least some acceptance, internal acceptance, though there is that which we can call sacred. I can't see a way around it, I don't think. I mean, that's like the very courageous question, I guess, is can there be secular hope? I don't think so. Because that would be, again, to be materialize the road. If you materialize the road in a secular sense, they're going to go die, right? They're still in the same world. So I think it has to be sacred. It has to be divine.
Yeah.
It's a big question, Steve.
That's a huge question. And I think you're right. But I also think there's sort of different kinds. There are different kinds of hope at play. And when you get to the most radical hope, where it seems like there is no likely imminent solution to your problems. So again, the road is a great example of that. The atmosphere isn't going to suddenly clear up, and the world's not going to suddenly come back to life, probably, in that novel. In those situations, and this is something that both Marcel and Hahn talk about, hope can still persist. The Father and the Son can embody hope. And the fact that it isn't grounded in a tangible hope does point to the transcendent. Now, I think that I think there are different possibilities here. I think someone can effectively be an unbeliever on one level and still experience that kind of hope. But I think they're not as much of an unbeliever as they think they are. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're putting their hope in the Christian God, but it does mean that they're putting their hope in the transcendent to some extent. He has a quote from Václav Havel in here, maybe I can find it quickly, that I thought was really striking in this regard. Hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. I don't think you can explain it as a mere derivative of something here, of some movement, or of some favorable signs in the world. I feel that its deepest roots are in the transcendental. And that's what I'm trying to get at with that point, that it's not necessarily that someone has to be subscribing wholesale to a religion or not even have doubt in God while this is all going on. But to the extent that you have that radical form of hope in the worst of circumstances, which does seem to be something fundamentally human in the fullest sense, then you're putting your hope into something transcendent. Now, I think, too, that this is often mediated by the other person or by the world. So again, the fact that it's mediated by the Son, I think, is very important in the road. And one thing that Hahn insists on throughout, that to be hopeful is to open yourself up to other people. And if we go back to wonder, our first conversation that we had was about the philosopher William Desmond and about his notion of wonder. And Desmond's always another of these thinkers that thinks about humans as fundamentally porous, but easily clogged by anxieties, by projects. And what does wonder do? It unclogs you. It breaks through and restores your receptivity. And in that way, I do think that there are these links between wonder and hope and openness. But I think, too, to put even a more theological point on it and to move more squarely into Christian theology, Ash Wednesday is right around the corner from when we're recording this conversation. And in Roman Catholic churches, I believe in Anglican churches too, you often have Stations of the Cross on Fridays during Lent, where you're meditating on Jesus on the crucifix. And I think that's a really powerful thing to reflect on in this notion that hope means opening yourself to the other, and it means opening yourself up to the future. So if you think about the image of Jesus on the cross, he's focused outward he's presented outward. We shouldn't say focused outward necessarily. He's presented outward towards the people. He's towards God. There's this openness even in the arms being opened. He's taking in all of the sin and the pain and the frustrations of the world, all the humiliation and degradation that we heap on each other and that are heaped on him. But there's also this openness to something beyond that. So in something like Stations of the Cross, when believers walk the Stations of the Cross, meditate on images of the Passion, and pray into that experience, in a way, even though it seems very gruesome to someone that's an outsider, or self-flagellating, look at how bad we are, look at what we've done. It's also, in a way of opening yourself up towards hope, because you're opening yourself, just like Jesus is opening himself up outward to the world and us. The Stations of the Cross are trying to teach us to open ourselves up to him, but also to everyone, to God. It's this exercise in suffering the pains of the world, but remaining open to both the world and to what's beyond it. And that's, I think, the hopeful disposition for Marcel and Han. It's not denying all the pains. It's not denying suffering. I think to be able to hope, you have to suffer, both in the sense that to suffer something means to undergo it patiently, but also suffer in the sense of pain.
But this is an individual. I mean, this is something, because you mentioned we both agreed, actually, that the final section, which is largely engaging with Heidegger, becoming very popular to, critique Heidegger for obvious reasons. But you mentioned the word project, and it's intriguing that I think what the thread that Hahn is pulling on near the end to draw in Heidegger and the notion of Dasein, of being there, is really of Dasein and Dasein's sort of individualness. Dasein as a project, right? As my own project toward authenticity, or whatever it might be, or craft, or whatever Heidegger wants to bring in. And it's interesting that Hahn brings out this like one section on hope in Being and Time, which is kind of apt, but it's to move from Dasein's being there as the individual project towards, I guess it would be being with the other, or something more akin to Levinas. But that the end section, Heidegger in relation to Marcel, is that seems that none of this that and this is once again a sort of trite point, but in that sort of the truth is cheesy way, is that none of what Hahn is really talking about in terms of hope seems to be able to enact itself organically without first a foundation of engagement with the other. You can't be in the bounds of Dasein, right? You can't be in your little hut or whatever it might be. It just is not going to work from that position. And yeah, I think it was one of the more needed uses of Heidegger at the end, but it was certainly the strongest chapter, I think.
I agree. I think that's the best chapter in the book. And Hahn is a thinker that's deeply influenced by Heidegger. It's there from the very beginning. I mentioned his first book, Heidegger's Heart, which is a meditation on fundamental mood, which is what he returns to at the end here. And here he's, as you say, pitting the fundamental mood of anxiety versus the fundamental mood of hope. And for him, the fundamental mood of anxiety turns back on itself in the end, and it's concerned with itself, with living the self before death, the relationship between self and death. Didn't put that exactly right, but and hope truly opens out to being with for Hahn. And he notes that even Heidegger's brief treatment of hope in Being and Time brings hope back to hope for the self. And this is something that is very Marcellian, very Levinas, but maybe even more Marcel. I think that Marcel is one of these thinkers that he tends not to be read because people assume that the best of Marcel has been absorbed and then improved upon in Levinas. It's not to take anything away from Levinas to say that that's not exactly the case, that there's plenty in Marcel that I think that I would prefer how he frames it to what how Levinas frames it. But Marcel and Levinas both emphasize that, say, the fear of death, it's not just our death that fears us. In fact, what strikes the most fear into us is the death of the other, the death of the beloved often. So yeah, there's this truer turn towards this truer opening out in hope vis-a-vis anxiety. He also makes this point again. I think that certain Heideggerians would want to argue with this, and there is nuance that he's not going to get into in a short book like this. But I also think he makes generally a fair point that for Heidegger, it's all about remembering and forgetting. There's this deep sort of positioning vis-a-vis the past, and Hahn thinks hope is more situated towards the future, while not severing you from yourself from the past. Yeah. So I think that final chapter is a really important stage in Hahn's lifelong or career-long two-step with Heidegger, where he builds on Heideggerian ideas like fundamental moods, but he's been trying to critique those from the very beginning as well. And I think this is his most pointed critique and probably the best part of the book.
And I wonder just, sort of, where is one now with all of this? Like what is one to do then? Because hope has that feeling of, well, what do you want me? How do you want me to engage with the world? And I don't think it's necessarily it's there and it isn't. But just to go back to something that I'd written down really that should have come in the start, but I think maybe it works better at the end. Hahn mentions this whole idea of apocalypse cells, right? So and it's interesting to think about this, that I do think in our own roundabout way, that which is being created by us tends to lag behind the general sentiment. And so in a certain fairly admittedly annoying sense, we are seeing with Musk a culture of hope re-arise. And it's undoubtable that, genuine belief in the space race again is absolutely hopeful. But I think a more important one would be, are apocalypse films? What's the profit margin on an apocalypse film? Because I remember growing up, it was all about the world ending. Apocalypse sells quite literally, and it seems to have always been that way in the modern world. It's almost like maybe we thought we had it too good, so we have to have a pressure valve to let out some steam or some bit of hubris or whatever. But I wonder if, it's a strange idea of what is it to create a hopeful film that isn't just asinine cheese, right? That you roll your eyes at and go, well, that's never going to happen. Like, what's a sincerely hopeful film? And I think if we start to see them, then maybe we could say that we're on our way out. But I think we are starting to see that. I think in the same way that people are bored of doom scrolling, people are bored of cynicism. I think people are getting bored of cynicism. And in the same way that anyone who's dealt with serious anxiety, excuse my crass language, but there's a point where you finally sit with it and you go, I'm fucking sick of this. I just can't do this anymore because it's so draining and so draining on the life that we've been talking about. So in our own weird way, almost like skipping through a field of daisies in Mordor, we are like, yeah, well, that might be awful, but I want to live. That seems to be where we're at. I think maybe Hahn is the as you said, he's the diagnostician. So maybe.
Yeah, maybe so. And I do think that this is one of the places where religion, institutional religion, needs to do a heck of a lot better job than it has. I could pick on a lot of things right now, but let's do that since this is one of Hahn's more theological books. I mean, if it reduces hope to a Hallmark card, or if it acts just like a dysfunctional bureaucracy most of the time, or an NGO most of the time, then it's not offering what it really has to give, which is this robust, spiritually serious engagement with the world. And certainly hope is a part of that. I think that a film like the films of Terrence Malick might be one place where you could see some of this.
Hidden Life.
Yeah,
My favorites.
certainly, and I think that you understand why, but it feels like it needs to earn its hopefulness. But on one side, but on another side, I think I would prefer to say that it's insisting on something that Han and Marcel are insisting upon, that true hopefulness can't just be a pat. Oh, this person you loved died. Well, don't worry, they're just in heaven, right? It's, there's this saccharine way of not being with the griever or being with grief. And again, I think this goes back to your point about fear. I mean, hope has to include the affect of fear, of suffering, of pain, of doubt to be the real thing. And I think that the great spiritual traditions, and not just Christianity for sure, but the great spiritual traditions are supposed to help us reach these places, these levels of wisdom, spiritual maturity, acceptance when it needs to be. And I don't think they've done a very good, or at least to Christianity, I don't think it's done a very good job of it recently. And by recently, I mean probably over hundreds of years at this point.
Are you hopeful?
Yeah, the silence speaks, doesn't it? I think I am to some extent. And again, I don't say that to be smug, and I think my my vices are many, but I do think that I often have the gift of hopefulness. But I also think that, we've talked a lot before. I struggle as much and probably more than many with screen addiction, with doom scrolling, with all these things that'll pull me away from the world and from my responsibilities to others, my responsibilities for my family, my responsibilities to people that I could be helping. And I do think that in that state, I'm not a very hopeful person. So yeah, it's the struggle.
That's honest.
Yeah. Also, I don't know whether would I have the hope of the father in The Road. I'd like to think so, but I don't want to be put to that test.
I mean, it's when you were talking about that, it's strange to think about him as a character, because it's almost like, he's reeling off. I don't want to downplay the character. I don't want to especially in the film, I don't want to downplay Viggo Mortensen's great acting, but he's reeling off these things that he knows are kind of transparent and almost empty. Yeah, he's kind of empty, but his emptiness is. So he's saying this whole thing about the fire, and you get the sense that he knows that that's what the boy needs, but it's in the boy's sincere engagement with that almost then passes the fire back to him. But the father is almost just going through the man, isn't it? He's almost just going through the motions. Like, that seems to be his hope is, we always see them waking up, right? Another day. What's today? Like the next, this day we found a load of food. What about this day? Well, this day we were in a load of cannibals. But right, next day, right? And like, he's just always matter of factly doing things that you feel like are given as of course. Right? There's one point where he swims out to a ship to just see if there's anything on it, like through the sea that's horrible and grey, and it's just a given. It's like, wait, not like of course, but he's like, well, let's swim to the ship now and see if there's any food there. So he's almost like just going through the motions, and then I mean, maybe that's what hope is. I get up and I just live. He's living the best he can. Yeah.
It's really interesting to think about this, because I do think that even as Han presents it as a fundamental mood, hope, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always filled with ecstatic, hopeful emotion. So again, in one way, I'm not even sure like I said, my first reading of The Road was pretty skeptical of the ending, and thought that maybe the best you could say about the father is that he's faking it till he makes it, in terms of the hopeful platitudes that he shares with his son. But the son, who pretty much only knows this world, can see that the way the father is acting is in a way miraculous. The father hasn't eaten the son. The father hasn't abandoned the son. The father hasn't given up. And again, there is something wondrous about that. So maybe it's not that the son is just the naive child. It's maybe that the son has the eyes to see how much the father is kind of a sign of opposition to the world that they're in. And they do seem to be doing something different than everyone else. They are living they are carrying the fire.
I mean, maybe that's what our position is as people who are, because I'm hearing this a lot about Zoomers and whatever. I think the latest generation is called the Alpha. I think I'm hearing, that they're checked out. I'm painting with extremely broad brushstrokes there, but I assume you could very quickly come to the conclusion as to why that might be the case. But sort of the immediacy of social media in terms of saying like this is from day one. I mean, social media for me didn't really begin to infiltrate my life fully until I was about 17. And so in the sense of like the father from the road, I'd had the experience of going out with my mates, all right, and no phones and walking around and playing and not having anything other than what we were just doing on that day, right? Which is a strange thing to think about now that now you're immediately from the whatever age it might be, like 4, tethered to here's terrible stuff all the time. Here's how bad the world is. And it's supposedly, I'm hearing that it's left sort of a culture of basically young people that are checked out. And so maybe it's the equivalent metaphorical relationship between older people, the strangeness of young people. If an older person said enjoy life, right? Like how odd is that going to be if they have been embroiled in this just gray, everything's awful, there's no hope culture? Maybe that's what's needed, of like, well, I can show you some, like the I mean, it's a pretty bad metaphor, but like the scene of the father going to all the effort to get the can of Coke in the road, right? Like you didn't need to do that, but like here's this small moment of enjoyment that's completely sincere. I don't know. Maybe I'm sort of tooting the older generations a bit too much there, but so maybe something like that is coming down the road.
Yeah, the Coke can is clearly the miracle in the novel. that's I think you can get an eye roll about the family showing up at the end, but the Coke can, that's real, and that's a real miracle in some ways. And there's a deep irony because it's this symbol of consumerism too. It's the vending machine and the Coca-Cola, but I still think there's something true about it.
And the complete I mean, be like little children, right? The naivety where he just the boy describes it as like not how we describe. We'd say fizzy, but he says like it's all bubbly or something. Like it's so alien to him. So yeah, it's an oddly beautiful moment which we then watch with jaded vision because it's this bright red can of Coke.
Yeah, and you also make me think about your conversation with Norman Wurzba again. One of the things that you two talked about, and if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to that one yet, you really should. It's really good. But you talk about the opposite of hope as being numbness, if I remember correctly, being numb. Yeah, and I think that's something that's a very Hanian idea, but doesn't really show up in the spirit of hope, at least not as prominently as you might expect. But that's something I appreciated about your conversation with Norman Wurzba, because I think that's right. Hope involves this openness, also this vulnerability, but also this kind of readiness that you don't have in numbness. And so many of us spend our lives in numbness.
Don't be numb.
There you go. Don't be numb. Easier said than done.
Yeah. How do you think this is going to hold as a part of the Han canon?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I would say that it seems to be a turning point in his thought. I think the emphasis on hope is fairly new. I think this book is both a little more political and a lot more theological than his other books. But I also think it has this status of kind of a promissory note. And with Han, since he publishes so much and he's on the move as a thinker, I think a real danger is reading too much into any one book. But this does seem to be of a piece of recent books like Vita Contemplativa as well, and a book that's going to be translated fairly soon called Praise the Earth, which is kind of his gardening journal, which is a lot more than gardening. It's a very, very kind of frankly spiritual work in a way that his others aren't. That I do think we're heading sort of at a different turn with Han, even as through lines like that emphasis on fundamental moods and on receptivity, on open friendliness to the world, these things that he's talked about all along, those are going to stay, but it seems like we're having some other turns around them that are kind of significant. We'll just have to see where it ends up.
Okay. Well, there you go. That was our thoughts on Byung-Chul Han's The Spirit of Hope. Yeah, seems like a good place to finish up. What are you working on now, Steve?
So I'm wrapping up a edited collection on William Desmond in literature called The Intimate Strangeness of Poetry. So Desmond, I mentioned him earlier in the interview, contemporary Irish philosopher, similar in many ways to Han, though certainly develops things in a much more systematic way. And then I edit this poetry journal that I started called New Verse Review, and that's taken a lot of my time recently too, but it's a real labor of love. So those are the things I'm working on, and trying not to be an achievement subject as I do them, but actually, enjoy them.
Sounds fascinating. Well, there we go. I'll put links for this book from Polity and our previous conversations in the description below. But Steve Knepper, once again.
Thanks again, James. Always a pleasure.